Research. Flat Earth.
The history.
Science or fiction? Hashimama Flat. Presence.
Fomenko. Rebuilding the chronology.
Chapter 1.
Do we know our history?
Since childhood, we've been taught to view history as an exact science of the past, like ancient Egypt, Babylon, Rome, Alexander's Empire, Charlemagne, the Middle Ages, and the Renaissance. Scientific books, museum exhibits, historical novels and films convince us that almost everything is known about these and other periods. And that to any question that crosses an inquisitive mind, there will be a ready answer made by historians. The abundant gaps in history that are still to be found are not considered to be of a fundamental character, and in the course of further research they will gradually be filled in and will soon disappear altogether. However, if one delves deeper into our past, one will come across many inconsistencies and strange things. Why, for example, did medieval painters, normally attentive to historical details, depict biblical and ancient characters as their contemporaries? How could ancient warriors kill their enemies with bronze balls if bronze did not exist at that time? And where did iron weapons come from in ancient Egypt? And why did so few monuments survive from the Middle Ages but so many others from much more distant periods? Logically, it should be the other way around. On what basis did Ivan the Terrible claim to be a direct descendant of the Roman Emperor Augustus? It would seem that these and many other mysteries should compel historians to study our past more closely, but this has not happened so far, so the question involuntarily arises: do we really know our history well? So what is history and what is chronology? History is the events of the past distributed along a timeline. Chronology is the timeline itself. Its upper part is our present, and its lower part is the period when people began to record the events that happened to them. It should be noted that the traditional version of history, which today is considered the only true one, did not always exist. Before the 16th century there was no continuous chronology of any kind. At best, people could date events from 100 or 150 years ago. Anything older than that was lost in the obscurity of time. Legends, myths and fables reached their contemporaries with great distortions, and that is why the need arose to make a coherent and consistent compilation of the most important events of human civilization from annual records, starting from antiquity. The father of chronology is believed to have been Eusebius Pamphili, also known as Eusebius of Caesarea. In the 4th century after Christ, at the time of the Roman Emperor Constantine. But unfortunately today it is not possible to read his chronicles in full, because the original is partially destroyed, and the rest is a voluntary translation into Latin by the Saint Eusebius Hieronymus. In the 14th century, Constantine Nicephorus Calixtus tried to write a new history of the first 3 centuries. But he did not succeed in saying anything new and limited himself to repeat what was written by Eusebius Pamphili. Instead, the chronology we know today was created and completed in the fundamental works of 2 chronologists of the 16th and 17th centuries, the historian and philosopher Joseph Justus Scaliger and the Jesuit theologian Dionysius Petavius. It is precisely their version of history that we study and know today. What was the historical chronology of Petavius and Scaliger based on? At first, it was based on a numerical data from the Bible, as well as on astronomical calculations, which at that time were very inaccurate and contained many errors. Sometimes they were wrong by hundreds or even thousands of years. Thus arose the database on which all historical chronology was later based. For example, the date of the creation of the world, about which theologians argued for hundreds of years.
The date of the creation of the world. This is a very interesting material that we have analyzed. In the 16th and 17th century, there were many dates of the creation of the world. The question is not scholastic, because from this date in many chronicles the dates of the events were counted. Depending on where we place the creation of the world, the events described by Titus Livy and Herodotus will depend. It turned out that there were about 20 scattered versions and many different opinions about when was the creation of the world, and these differences reached 3,000 years. Therefore, the chronologies based on this way of counting the years have a fluctuating divergence of 2,000 or 3,000 years, which is a huge amount.
Another very important point of reference on which the famous history of Titus Livius is based is the year of foundation of Rome. But in the chronology of Rome there are so many contradictions that not only do we not know the year of its foundation, but we do not even know the century of its foundation. The generally accepted official version says that it was founded in the 8th century BC by the twin brothers Romulus and Remus, who were suckled by the she-wolf Luperca, symbol of the city. But there is another version, according to which it was founded by Enio and Odysseus and named after the mythological goddess of Troy called Roma. By the way, this is how it is spelled in Latin. Rome. Well, if this is true, then the foundation of Rome took place after the Trojan War, in which Aeneas and Odysseus also participated, that is, not in the 8th century BC but in the 13th century BC. How do you reconcile these versions? It turns out that Rome was founded 500 years earlier, or that the Trojan War took place 500 years later. This is not a minor fact, since the history of Greece, Egypt and Western Europe is based on Roman chronology. Consequently, a change in Roman chronology implies a change in the history of all the states associated with it. Another real circumstance is that modern man is accustomed to date from the beginning of our era or from the nativity of Christ, which occurred 2023 years ago. but this has not always been the case. The year of Christ's birth was calculated by the Roman Dionysius. The Roman Dionysius the Less in the 6th century after Christ, that is, more than 500 years after the event itself. Due to the constant dispute over the accuracy of the actual date of Christ's birth, the term before Christ began to be used in papal documents only from the year 1431. Let us leave aside the various methodologies to determine this date and let us go to the most specific detail we have about the description of the Savior's birth. The Star of Bethlehem. When Jesus was born in Bethlehem, came to him the wise men from the east and asked, "Where is the Jewish king who has been born? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him." The star they saw in the east was before them, and when they finally came and stood over the place, it was just the place where the child was. According to all astronomical accounts, the Gospel describes the appearance of a new star, which gave rise to the crab-shaped nebula in the constellation Taurus. It was not until the 20th century that scientists realized that this new superstar could have been born in the period between 1110 and 1170 CE. 2,000 years ago, nothing like that could have happened in the cosmos. In general, chronology is not an easy art. You have to know different ways of recording data, compare ancient calendars, know how to analyze ancient eclipses. The chronologists of the Middle Ages were just learning it.
For example, many chronologists of the 14th, 15th, and 16th century dated events by the day of the equinox. The equinox is a very delicate event. It is very difficult, without measuring instruments, to establish exactly on what date the day equals the night. And an error of 1 day means a chronological error of about 100 years. If they are wrong by 5 days. And there are examples of such errors. In the chronicles of the 15th century, the error was 500 to 600 years.
On such inaccurate calculations, Scaliger's chronology was built, and along with it the commonly accepted version of current world history. Usually historical facts are built on the written texts in the chronicles. But the actual facts can be distorted in them. Take for example the differences in the scriptures about the creation of Rome. It often happens that the same person receives different names, depending on which source names him. Usually the chronicles that relate versions of events are written many years or even centuries after the event itself. Therefore, if we believe that in such and such a year, half the world was conquered by Genghis Khan, it does not mean that whoever wrote about it was an eyewitness. Moreover, words and names may have changed their meaning. For example, texts used to be written without vowels. And some types of Arabic scripts, for example, lacked vowel signs altogether. Naturally, over time, the unmarked vowels became confused and were replaced by others. Then a historian read it, and he sees the abbreviations PRS. Could it be Persia? Or maybe Paris? Or Prussia? Or take Neapolis, or as it was called in ancient chronicles, a new city. And just as Neapolis in Italy, Carthage in Tunisia also means new city. There was a Neapolis in Palestine, Scythian Neapolis, and not to mention the Russian Novgorod. If the chronologist does not provide more details, it is very difficult to understand which Neapolis we are talking about. The same thing happens with the names. In some part of the text they mention a certain Charles, which in English sounds like Charles, and in French is Charles, and in Spanish is Carlos. So which one are they referring to? The English commander, the French courtier, or the great one from Spain? The correct interpretation of ancient texts is also of great importance for the accuracy of dating, but this is not always the case. For example, many lists of Egyptian pharaohs are preserved that contain only their names, with no dates or facts. There's also no certainty that all of them were exactly pharaohs and not dignitaries of high rank. And from these lists of names Egyptologists fabricated countless dynasties. The periods of rule were agreed upon very roughly, calculating about 3 pharaohs per century. The Egyptologists simply agreed to consider them all as pharaohs, and each ruled for exactly 33 years. A scientific approach with many quotation marks.
And in general, this is the attitude towards chronology has survived to the present day, and today historians mostly work on a chronology created by someone else, without checking anything. With no knowledge of how these dates have arrived here. But what they do know is to use these dates to fill in some political discourse, to add them to all history textbooks, to invent scientific articles. They turn those tables around just to give them a format of scientism to their current fantasies.
However, despite the fact that most of the existing texts on the history of Egypt are written in Greek, at least they exist. As for the history of India, there are no documents at all that can be dated. There are only legends, folk tales, and very little documentary evidence. In order to recreate the history of ancient India, we are forced to a large extent to rely on the writings of the ancient Indians, to rely on the writings of Greek geographers and Arab travelers, who often could not even pinpoint exactly where India was located. They confused it with Africa, or even with Italy. But this did not prevent Scaliger's chronology from qualifying India's history as one of the oldest on Earth. Another reason for chronological inaccuracies is the various forms of abbreviations in the recording of dates. For example, the 3rd century after the birth of Christ could be called the 3rd century since Christ and written as X3, where X is the first letter of the word Christ. In the Middle Ages, this symbol was the most common anagram for the name of Christ. Consequently, the 1st century was written X1, the 2nd is X2, and so on. It is possible that from these abbreviations arose the names of the centuries adopted today. However, later medieval chronologists began to indicate the letter X as the Roman numeral 10. Such an interpretation automatically adds 1,000 years to the original date, and the 3rd century immediately becomes the 13th century. Another abbreviated way of recording the name of Jesus Christ could have been the Latin letter I, which comes from the first letter of Jesus' name. What we interpret as 1,300 years could have originally meant I-300, i.e. 300 years after Christ. A clear example is the ODYSEE Zurich publishing age, supposedly from the year 1597. This example is interesting because it has the dates in Arabic and Roman numerals, as well as in the date 1524 in an engraving by Albrecht Dürer, we see that not only the first letter is separated by a dot from the rest of the numbers, but it is clearly written as a Latin I with it, that is, as the first letter of the name of Jesus. This is exactly how the misinterpretation of the Chronicles has led to change many centuries of people's history. On paper, of course, but these are the very written sources with which we study the history of the world. Medieval maps also deserve special attention. We are used to seeing on maps the east on the right, the west on the left, and the north at the top and the south at the bottom. But this was not always the case. Many medieval maps were upside down, and in them the west was on the right, the east is on the left, exactly as seen in the nautical maps in Pietro Visconti's atlas. For example, on the map of the Black Sea, the north is at the bottom, the south at the top, and the Crimean Peninsula is shown upside down. This is a map of the Mediterranean Sea. East on the left and west on the right. A map of Spain and Africa. Africa at the top and Spain at the bottom. And this is a flipped map of England and France. France on the left, England on the right.
In the old maps, we find some very interesting things that are inconsistent with the traditional version of history. First of all, medieval geography was very imprecise, and completely different cities could be designated by the same name. This is how modern interconnections of historical events with this or that geographical name are far from always correct. Because they correspond to modern historians' ideas about where and when, what and how it was called. But if we open the maps, we see a very different picture of the world.
This is a map from the Encyclopedia Britannica of 1771. You can see that the Russian Empire is represented as several different countries. The largest is Moscow Tartary, with its capital at Tobolsk, which is 3 times the area of Russia, with its capital at St. Petersburg. And then there is independent Tatarstan with its capital in Samarkand and Chinese Tatarstan with its capital in Qingyan. This information can hardly be considered false or fiction, since the Encyclopedia Britannica was at the height of theoretical knowledge at the time. Why then is nothing known about these states today? And above all, where does the name Tartary come from on the maps of the 18th century, if, according to the official version of history, at that time the Tatar-Mongol yoke did not exist 300 years ago?
Modern historians are very reluctant to discuss these and thousands of other strange mysteries of their version of history. They may note that in museums, as long as you ask simple questions, they will gladly answer them. But any question about dates or about these oddities irritates the guide, let alone the staff of these museums.
Today, museums, art galleries, and private collections hold many artifacts that supposedly serve as proof of the accepted version of human history. For example, there are many bronze objects traditionally attributed to the Bronze Age. Yet historians for some reason are not embarrassed by the fact that bronze in the Bronze Age simply could not be manufactured, because bronze is an alloy of copper and tin was only discovered in the Middle Ages. So why could bronze not have appeared before tin? Then, a question arises. How, and especially when were these items made? How can we explain that iron objects were found in the Pyramid of Cheops? Where did the iron come from? In ancient Egypt. Historians insist that it is a meteorite that fell from the sky. Hypothetically, it is possible that iron meteorites were found in ancient Egypt, but research carried out in the 20th century has shown that it is more likely that this iron was obtained industrially. A similar finding was also made in the tomb. In the mummy of the pharaoh who supposedly lived in the 14th century BC, gold and metal daggers were found. Here then another enigma among many. It is known that glass is an amorphous material and that within 5 or 6 centuries, it crystallizes and becomes cloudy. That is why, by the way, the famous stained glass windows of the ancient Cathedral of Rheims in France perish. How to explain then that glass vessels manufactured, as historians claim, 10 or even 15 centuries ago have not lost their original form? Perhaps there is no mystery in it, simply the antiquity of these vessels is somewhat exaggerated, in which case many things can be explained.
It seems to me that history lacks logic in general. Today we should teach not only history but many other social sciences using logic. You know, in the old school, back in the middle of the 20th century, there was that subject, logic, but today unfortunately it doesn't exist. I would revive it and try to make sure that logic is applied in history and that it is not trampled on.
There are many things that historians don't like to talk about because they clearly contradict what is accepted by history and chronology. Take, for example, a well-known plot in medieval painting, the Calvary and the Passion of Christ. How did the artists depict this event? It turns out that they were convinced that Palestine was covered with lush vegetation, and Jerusalem was situated on the banks of a mighty river or a great strait. This is St. Lawrence Cathedral in Nuremberg. One of the paintings depicts the descent of the cross of the Savior. Look, you can clearly see the wide blue river and the hills. This is the cathedral of the city Aachen. In this painting large branching trees are clearly visible, a narrow or wide river. But in Jerusalem there is simply neither one nor the other. But in this canvas there is another curious detail. Next to the cross there is a man with a fur cap. By the way, in one of Dürer's engravings, which depicts the way of the cross of Christ, you can also see a similarly dressed character, who also wears a fur cap and a sheepskin coat. So according to medieval artists, what was the climate like in Jerusalem? We are now in Sweden, in the Swedish Museum at the Royal Palace in Uppsala. This painting represents the procession of Christ in a rather unusual way. As you can see, the horsemen are wearing turbans and the flagpoles are topped with crescent moons on the backs of the warriors. The shields have a crescent moon on one and an Orthodox cross on the other. Another interesting peculiarity is often observed in medieval paintings. It was not uncommon for medieval artists to depict Old Testament characters as their contemporaries. Here, the biblical character Joshua, who lived long before the birth of Christ, is depicted as a typical medieval knight. And on the towers of ancient Jericho, which are being assaulted by Joshua, we have visible Christian crosses. Here is an icon of reverence. The Holy Virgin is depicted in a typically medieval setting surrounded by books, which during her lifetime did not yet exist. This is a Bible from the Gutenberg Museum in Mainz. You see, the medieval illustrator armed his Old Testament troops with cannons that were quite modern for his time. In the painting The Trial of Paris by Lucas Cranach, who lived in the 13th century BC, medieval armor is depicted. And there are countless examples like it. Historians call it a medieval anachronism. In their opinion, the Middle Ages somehow mixed all concepts and epochs. The artists were ignorant people, but there are examples in the literature of the Petrarch period. For some reason it proves the falsity of the privileges given to the Austrian House of Hamburg by Caesar. It would seem that there is nothing to prove. The falsification is evident since according to the commonly accepted chronology the Habsburgs and the Cese are separated by thousands of years. Why then was it not obvious to Petrarch, one of the most brilliant minds of the Renaissance? It is something to ponder.
Historians don't have a very clear understanding of what history is. They do not have a clear distinction between the concepts of the past, which is already gone and which today we can only access through some memories and artifacts. The history that is available today on bookshelves, written by historians, that is something to be admired, resented or scolded. These are two completely different things, and historians don't get it.
Another problem that it is not customary to talk about is the falsification. It is sad, but it is a fact. Not all ancient artifacts are authentic. Usually in life fakes are introduced and go unnoticed. If the fakes have not come to light for a generation, then for the next generation they become authentic. For example, one of the most scandalous forgeries of recent times was the forgery of the frescoes of the Holy Spirit Hospital and St. Mary's Church in the German city of Lübeck. Due to bombing in 1942, part of the plaster of the church collapsed. A 13th century fresco was discovered underneath. After the war, it was decided to restore the frescoes in 1948. A certain Dietrich Fay was invited. Dietrich Fay, who, by the way, was already on trial for forgery of a work of art, was invited, and he brought his assistant Lothar Malskat, also a great specialist in forgeries. Once the restoration was finished, Fay and Malskat announced that they had managed to uncover an ancient mural on the church wall that were hidden under later layers. After 3 years of work, the unveiling of the restored church was celebrated for the city's 70th anniversary. A postage stamp was even issued to commemorate the event. The frescoes would probably still be considered ancient if the city authorities had rewarded the two restorers for their work. But only Dietrich Fay got the cross. Malskat received nothing. He was very offended and publicly confessed that at Fay's request, he had erased the 13th century frescoes and, guided by photos, painted new frescoes. A special commission inspected the frescoes and declared that Malskat was lying. When the virtuoso restorer asked the commission members to take a closer look at the faces of the saints, the commission was stunned. The saints had the face of Genghis Khan, of Rasputin, of Marlene Dietrich, and even Malskat's own sister. The scandal was increasing, and the commission discovered other masterpieces of the restorers, in particular, fake frescoes in the Church of St. Catherine in the same city of Lübeck. By the way, it turned out that Malskat did not even remove the old plaster and painted directly over it. Consequently, restoring the 13th century paintings was impossible and the frescoes were destined to die in time. And here it is pertinent to ask to what extent one can give credence to claims about the antiquity of this or that mural. If the Lubeck frescoes perished in 500 years, then what about the dating of other frescoes, supposedly even older? And how many more forgeries are still considered true? Most Russian and Western historians are convinced that the Slavs are one of the youngest races on Earth and that at the time of Caesar and Alexander the Great, the Slavs were dressed in animal skins. And it makes you want to think about the Etruscans. It is believed that even before the foundation of Rome, the Etruscans lived in that territory, and it was they who cast the bronze statue of the Capitoline magnifying glass, which by the way attests to its ability to work metals perfectly. But here is a marvel, having left behind many of the written monuments, fine articles, statues, and inculcated well-fortified cities such as Cagua, Florence, Bologna, etc. The Etruscans suddenly vanished without a trace. As for the remaining texts, a whole generation of scholars who have been working on them have been unable to decipher them. In Italy there is even a saying Etruscan non ligatur, which, translated into Russian, means Etruscan cannot be read. But what is even more surprising is that in Russia, people learned to read Etruscan as early as the 19th century thanks to Tadeusz Wolanski, who suggested that Etruscan was a language close to Slavic and even made up an Etruscan alphabet. There was nothing surprising about that. It turned out that these Etruscan letters coincide 1/3 with Cyrillic. If we use Wolanski's alphabet, then for us the supposedly unreadable texts and inscriptions do not even need translation. Judge for yourselves. This is an original with Etruscan text. Vol daet maja chza niy legcheat. Here is the completely obvious translation. I give my will, it may be that my beloved is longing for it. It means that Etruscan can perfectly well be considered a variant of Slavic, which arose and spread even before the foundation of Rome. This leads, to put it mildly, to a kind of revision of the whole history of mankind backwards, a revision of traditional views about the Slavs themselves who, during the heyday of the great European civilization, supposedly lived in some nook and cranny on the margins of Europe and played no important role in world history, for while in Europe they were opening universities, Russia was under the rule of the Tatar Mongols.
We are told that a horde of nomadic savages supposedly emerged from the dusty, desolate and deserted steppes. Desolate steppes and stony deserts of Mongolia, marched thousands of miles, reached Russia, conquered that mighty state, moved on, conquered some countries of Western Europe, went still further, entered Egypt and planted there a dynasty of Mamluks, then mysteriously disappeared, leaving only such a Mongol empire of it is not well known who and how it was created.
The 300-year empire of Genghis Khan left behind neither chronicles nor governmental documents in Mongolian language. No. The diplomas of the Grand Dukes, clerical charters and ecclesiastical documents were preserved, but only in Russian. How did it happen? How they ruled and left nothing behind. So perhaps the Russian scientist Lev Gumilev was right, who claimed that the theory of the Mongol-Tatar yoke in Russia was created in the 18th century under the influence of the ideas of the allegedly Arab origin of the Russians, and the authors of this idea, the foreigners Miller and Schlosser, only fulfilled a certain political order. another mystery of Russian history. Why Athanasius Nikitin's book A Journey to India, written for a Russian reader, is partly written in Arabic? And these are not quotations from Arabic authors. The narrative passes smoothly from Russian into Arabic and back again. So it turns out that two languages were spoken in Russia at that time, otherwise for whom was it written? This version is also confirmed by inscriptions on ancient Russian arms made in Arabic. Today it is commonly believed that these weapons were supposedly made in Turkey, Persia, and other Muslim countries. Why then, even in the time of the early Romanovs, that is, already in the 17th century, Russian gunsmiths decorated arms with Arabic characters and inscriptions, and even the royal arms, which today are kept in the armory. Or take the steel helmet of Tsar Mikhail Fyodorovich. Around the points of the helmet, there is a strip of Arabic sayings. One of them sounds like Vabashir al-Mu'minai, which translates as make the faithful happy. There are also many enigmas related to the Russian Tsars. For example, it is often believed that during the reign of Ivan the Terrible, Russia was a weak state and had no great influence over its neighboring states. But here is an interesting fact. To this day, European museums preserve letters of Ivan the Terrible to European monarchs, the tone of which is amazing. Here is, for example, how the letter of Ivan the Terrible to King Gustav I of Sweden, the original of which is preserved in the archives in Sweden, sounds. Your lineage is that of a common man, and not of a monarch. When from Novgorod the governors of the great sovereign king of Great Russia send their ambassador to King Gustav of Sweden must kiss the cross before this ambassador, for you will not be able to escape from our governors. That is, Ivan the Terrible did not consider the Swedish king as his equal. We continue reading. Why do we honor King Magnus with our town Palchev? And other cities? Because we are free to do God's will with our territory. So it turns out that Ivan the Terrible considered Europe as his fiefdom, and the monarchs there as vassals, who had no right to appeal to him directly, but only through intermediaries. This he explained thus. From Caesar Augustus comes our lineage. But, perhaps this is an isolated example, because Gustav I was not an heir but an elected king? Here is another letter of Ivan the Terrible addressed to another European monarch, Elizabeth I Tudor, preserved in the London archives. Here Tsar Ivan respectfully refers to himself as we, but addresses the Queen of England with a derogatory you, and at the end of the letter even calls her a vulgar maiden. Historians explain this contemptuous tone by a mental illness of Ivan the Terrible. Why then did the European monarchies recognize his lineage? What if Ivan the Terrible could really be a descendant of Caesar Augustus? They are supposed to be separated by 1,500 years. Or maybe it is much less. Here's another example. One of the national treasures of France was the ancient Slavonic Bible, which was brought as a gift to her husband Henry I, Princess Anna Yaroslav, as a gift, daughter of Yaroslav the Wise. For many centuries, this Bible was used at the coronation ceremonies of French kings. Why did the Slavonic Bible become an object of family value for the Catholic kings? In addition, Henry I personally met the bride at the border. For the French monarch, this marriage was much more honorable than for the Russian princess. Question: genuine. How can it be that for several centuries, even the best minds of the times did not notice numerous incongruities in history? Of course they did. Each new generation of scholars has had great difficulty reconciling much of the chronological data with the official version of Scaliger and Petavian. Isaac Newton. In the early 18th century, based on the natural sciences, significantly transformed Scaliger's chronology. In general, Newton's chronology is substantially shorter than the official chronology of today. Most of the events dated before Alexander the Great were moved up in the timeline, rejuvenated. This revision of Scaliger's chronology is not as radical as in Scaliger's writings. But Newton did not understood well in which direction the chronology had to be modified, and did not go beyond the limit of our era. He believed that from the 4th century after Christ, the chronology was reliable. Jean Hadouin. The director of the French Royal Library, Professor of Theology Jean Hardouin, claimed already in 1690 that most of the works of antiquity were forgeries written by monks in the 13th century, and Gordon was the unquestionable authority not only in theology, but also in archaeology, philology, and many other sciences. Mikhail Lomonosov. In the middle of the 18th century, Lomonosov opposed the new version of Russian history that was being created before his eyes by the Germans Miller and Bayer, so he harshly criticized Miller's recently published thesis on the origin of the name and people of Russia. He wrote withering reviews of Bayer's work. It seems to me that he resembles a priest who, disguised in robes and cassocks, gives totally dubious, obscure, incomprehensible and absolutely wild answers. Thus began the struggle for Russian history. Robert Baldauf. German philologist of the 19th century. Robert Baldauf, researching the ancient poetry of Homer, Sophocles and Aristotle, discovered that the style of their works reminds him of the manner of the medieval troubadours, and that in the Latin the influence of the Italian and German language is perceived. Baldauf concluded that all these ancient writers were in fact Italian humanists of the Renaissance. Theodor Mommsen. Theodor Mommsen was a German historian of the 19th century. He was one of the leading representatives of a scholarly current called hypercriticism. Mommsen wrote about the explicit discordances in Roman chronology. It was he who drew attention to the discrepancy in the dating of such an important event as the founding of Rome, of 500 years. Nikolai Morozov. The fate of Nikolai Morozov was not easy. At the age of 20, Morozov became a member of a nationalist organization. In 1881 he was sentenced to life imprisonment and was imprisoned in a fortress. He was imprisoned in a Russian fortress. There he studied chemistry, physics, astronomy, mathematics, and history on his own. He was released in 1905 after spending almost 25 years in prison. After his release he actively engaged in scientific and pedagogical activities, and after the October Revolution became director of the Leskov Institute of Natural Sciences. He put forward and partly justified the fundamental hypothesis that the chronology of antiquity proposed by Scaliger was rather artificially lengthened and should be revised up to the 6th century of our era. This hypothesis is based on the repetitions he found. What does this mean? Morozov suggested that different historical texts dated the same events to different years. This could be due to transcriptions or translation of the texts by different European chronologists, so that later the same events were perceived as completely different and unrelated events. They were dated and placed on a chronological axis, independently of each other, and the result was that duplicates or phantom reflections of the real historical periods were formed in the chronology. In the annals of the various centuries appear dynasties of rulers with strikingly similar biographies, such as Augustus and Constantine I, both descended from humble families and brave warriors marked by previous emperors. By Caesar and Diocletian respectively for their intelligence and bravery. Both had internal enemies for which later wars arose, from which they both emerged victorious and became sole rulers. Then follow many more coincidences, including the death of both. Both became suddenly ill and died on the way. Similar similarities can be traced in other pairs of emperors.
Fomenko.
In fact, how important is it to the average modern person? When was Rome founded? 500 years earlier or 500 years later? When did the Peloponnesian War take place? And hundreds of other wars. What does all this have to do with everyday life, with your problems and concerns? Will knowing the new history make you happier, more successful, or richer?
Chronology from our point of view is the crest of history, it is the backbone of history. And if it turns out that if this backbone does not work, does not have strength, then the whole edifice of history will collapse. That is why historians are so afraid of our criticism of them.
In history, there have been many examples of political decisions, I would say very important political decisions, that have led to catastrophic outcomes. And they were made with history in mind. That actually happened and happened many times.
Chronology underpins the whole edifice of history. Depending on what the dates are, we will have a different version of history. But not just one version. The date determines our view of culture, of language, of the history of civilization, and the way humanity has evolved. A change of date affects all this radically. Many events of the modern and near-modern times of the 19th century receive a new focus of attention. If you know what the correct history was, the correct history, before the 17th century.
So how do historians determine historical dates? How do they make this time scale? What methods do they use for this, and is it possible to check its effectiveness? Our next film will tell you about it.
Pachamama Flat.